The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Then they came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him, and with a loud cry came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this?" A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In the Gospel today from Mark, a couple times it's noted that Jesus has authority. The people are astonished because his teaching has authority, not like that of the scribes. And even at the end they say this is a new teaching that comes with great authority. There's a story told of Mother Teresa towards the end of her life in India. A wealthy Catholic man had a ship that came into harbor, and he had some goods on it that needed to be unloaded. So he went to the port authority. He said, could you please make sure that things are unloaded from my ship before it spoils and goes bad? And the officer there said, no, it's not going to happen. And the man pleaded with the officer for a little while. He said, nope, I'm not going to do anything to unload your ship. So the man was a little bit distraught, and he went and sought out Mother Teresa, asking for her help. The two of them walked back together to the port authority, to the officer, and Mother Teresa turned to the officer and said, please make sure that man's ship gets unloaded. And the officer said, yes, Mother, right away, Mother. As they were going back, as the man and Mother Teresa were walking back to her place in silence along the road, Mother Teresa quietly turned to the man and said, sometimes it's good to be Mother Teresa. She had a certain amount of authority, right? She spoke with a kind of authority that the other man did not have. They said the same thing, but Mother Teresa carried an amount of credibility and authority behind her, much like Jesus in the gospel. And we all know people like that, right? When they speak, we listen a little bit more closely because their words carry more weight with us. What is it about that? I think as people in the gospel note that Jesus' teaching, his words are different, they're authoritative. Where does that come from? Well, I think part of it is knowledge. I think part of us, anybody speaking on authority, is speaking from what you know. There's a certain basis of knowledge. Jesus knows the scriptures. Jesus knows how to live the right way. He knows what his Father wants. And as Jesus knows the law, the scriptures, he knows how to clarify the law and to interpret it correctly. Because the scribes and the Pharisees, they also know the scriptures and the law inside and out. That's their job. That's what they do. And so they know what the religious law says. They're teachers of the people, and they speak for God to some point. Yet maybe one of the differences is that the scribes and the Pharisees, they know the letter of the law, but Jesus knows the spirit of the law. He knows what's behind the law, who and what the law is meant to protect, what values that law protects, when the law can be relaxed, when do you bend the law, where are there gray areas, where is it black and white. He knows that law is at the service of human beings and not the other way around. So Jesus knows the spirit behind the law, but he also knows the lawgiver himself. Jesus has a relationship with his Father, the one who gave people the law. So he also knows the mind of the lawmaker and the lawgiver, so he knows what's behind the law. But I think the biggest difference between Jesus and the scribes is simply the fact that Jesus backs up his authoritative words with actions. In the gospel, he says, quiet, come out of him, and that's exactly what the unclean spirit does. Elsewhere, early on in Mark's gospel, there's a story where some people lower a paralyzed man down from the roof in front of Jesus. Jesus speaks words to forgive the man's sins, and then to back up his authority as one who forgives sins, Jesus speaks the words to stand up and walk. So when Jesus speaks, certain things happen. Shortly after this gospel passage in Mark, Jesus and his disciples will be picking grain on the Sabbath and eating it, something forbidden by Sabbath law. And Jesus says, hey, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he knows when he's allowed to break the law. Shortly after that, Jesus will heal the withered hand of a man in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, something that's not permitted to do. He knows when he's allowed to relax the law. He knows how to interpret it. He knows where to bend the law. So Jesus knows that very well, and so his words, and he can prove that he has authority to bend the law, because when he speaks, things happen. Unclean spirits are removed, and people who are hurt are healed. And so I think the biggest difference between the scribes and Jesus is that Jesus backs up his words with his actions. And so maybe for us, in looking at having a certain amount of authority or credibility in our lives as Christians, first, important to note that it's not about ever lording our authority over anybody else, right? It's not about bossing anybody around. Jesus makes it clear that we are not to do that as Christians. It's not about having authority and getting into arguments and debates to win all those arguments and debates, to prove that you're right and other people are wrong. It's not what having authority is about. However, as Christians, we should have a certain amount of credibility and authority when we speak, so that there's some weight to our words. Because we're ones who profess the Christian life, we have faith in Jesus Christ, and we really want to pass our faith on to others, right? Especially your children, your relatives, spouse, friends. You want to be able to pass your faith on and be able to speak with some amount of credibility. So where does that come from? Our authority and our credibility as Christians? Well, I think first it comes from our knowledge, our knowing God's law, our knowing our faith. We can't speak about things that we know nothing about. There's no authority if we have no clue and we're ignorant about our Christian faith. So you need to know what you're talking about, first of all. That's where you gain some authority. But secondly, like Jesus, I think it's important that you know the person behind the law, the person behind the scriptures, the person behind our faith, God himself. So that you have some kind of personal relationship with God. That way you know the mind of the one for whom you speak every now and then. You speak on his behalf when you try to teach your children and grandchildren and other people about the faith. But like Mother Teresa and like Jesus, your words carry a lot more weight, you have a lot more credibility if you can back up your words with the way that you act, with the way that you live your life. And this is not about never sinning, about avoiding sin at all costs. We try to do that anyway. But the idea is that you profess the Christian faith, okay? Your family knows that, many of your friends know that, a lot of people know that. So how are you treating these other people? The ones that sometimes you preach to with your words, how do you treat them with your actions? You tell your children not to lie. So do they hear you lying every now and then? Do you encourage them to lie on your behalf sometimes? You tell your children not to cheat, but do you cheat in some ways also in your life? You tell your spouse he needs to be more patient. So are you patient? You might tell your spouse not to yell at the kids. Would you yell at the children? You tell other people to pray. Are you praying? You tell people to listen, to understand a little bit better. Are you listening and trying to understand as well? And so that you gain some authority and credibility in your words when your actions back that up, of course. This is the year for youth in the Diocese of San Bernardino, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, through the end of August of this year. And so in thinking about how to pass on the faith to teens or high school students, part of what's important in doing that is how you back up your words with your actions. Bishop Barnes writes in his pastoral letter on the year for youth, he writes, "The family home remains the primary garden in the growth of a child's faith. I offer my support and my belief in the parents of the Diocese of San Bernardino and the key role that they play. If a child does not see the Catholic faith lived out consistently and lovingly by his or her parents and siblings, no amount of formation in the church community can compensate for this." So if children, they don't see you living out your Christian faith joyfully, lovingly, consistently, nobody else makes up for that. They're not going to get it from us here at the parish or some other workshop at the diocese. They're not going to get it anywhere else for the most part if they don't get it from you. You're not just the first teachers of your children in the mind of the Catholic Church, you're also the best teachers, which means you can teach good things and bad things, right? They're going to follow very much your example. They may listen to your words and you may think they don't hear much, but actually sometimes, those words stick with them. Sometimes they bring those words into conversations with friends, and they'll use those words later on in life. But it's your example that gives them, that's the best teacher to your children about the ways of faith. We look for, have a little bit of credibility and authority as Christians in our lives. We can do that when we know what we're talking about, when we know our Catholic faith, and also when we know God personally and have a relationship with Him. But best of all, we have some kind of credibility and authority in our lives, like Mother Teresa and like Jesus, when our lives, when our actions match the faith and the words that we profess.